Excellent, everyone. Well, with that in mind, I would like to say hello and welcome everyone for joining us. We have a few people still coming through, but we have a big event and a wonderful panel of speakers lined up, so we'll get started. My name is Caitriona Dowd and I'm an assistant professor in security studies at Dublin City University, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all today to this event by the Irish Consortium on Gender-Based Violence. Following on from the 20th anniversary of UN Resolution 1325 last month, it's my pleasure to welcome you to a discussion hosted by the ICGBV, aiming to explore how to build a feminist women, peace and security agenda. A really warm welcome to all of you and a huge thank you to our speakers for being with us today. The aim of our discussion is to explore how we can make progress in this agenda, and particularly to think about fundamentally challenging and transforming existing gendered norms and ethos on which the security sector might be built. In this discussion, we'll aim to look at the ways that a feminist agenda might more fundamentally reshape the peace and security sphere as we look ahead to future advancements in women, peace and security, and reflect on successes from the last 20 years of this agenda. Our plan for today is that the discussion will run for 1.5 hours. We'll begin with opening remarks, followed by comments from each of our speakers, and then we'll move to moderated discussion and questions from the audience. And we'd really like to encourage you to share your questions and comment and share your insights and reflections as well. We're really honoured to have such a wonderful expert group in our audience and our participants as well. So to share a question with the panel, we'd ask that you please put a question in the chat. We'll be moderating the chat and able to pull out some key questions as they come through. If you would really like to ask a question, you can use the raise hand function, and we'll aim to come to you if the discussion and time permit. So there's a raise hand function in the participants window, and if we're able to, we'll come to people to pitch their question directly. And just to note that if there's a question around documents or reports or resources that are mentioned in the discussion, we can try to put those in the chat, but we can also circulate those in an email to follow up. I think that leaves us only to say a huge thank you again, as I said, to each of our speakers who I'll introduce in turn. But before moving to our panel, I'd like to welcome Áine Hearns, the Director of the Conflict Resolution Unit at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, who's kindly agreed to say a few words of opening. Áine, as I mentioned, is the Director of the Conflict Resolution Unit with responsibility for Ireland's National Action Plan on UNSCR 1325. Áine led on the development of Ireland's first and third National Action Plans, and the unit is also involved in promoting peace building and lesson sharing from the Northern Irish peace process as well. So we're delighted to have you with us, Áine, and I'll hand over to you there.
Thank you very much indeed, Caitriona, and hello to everybody. Thanks so much for inviting me to open this panel discussion here today. I suppose starting off, as you've said, 2020 is an important year for the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, marking the 20th anniversary of Security Council Resolution 1325, the first on the WPS agenda, and also it's the 25th anniversary of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. And as such, of course, it's one in which we should take stock of where we are on this important topic. From the perspective of the Irish government, I would have to say that many of you will already be aware that advancing the WPS agenda is a major priority for Ireland as we look forward to taking our seat on in the UN Security Council on the 1st of January next. Indeed, gender equality and women's empowerment is a priority for Ireland across all aspects of our foreign and development policy, and our work on the WPS agenda is central to this. As we outlined most recently at the open debate in the UN at the 20th anniversary of the Resolution 1325, Ireland will seek to ensure that we embed gender perspectives right across the Council's activities. So we feel strongly that the Council must step up and more consistently integrate gender perspectives into its briefings, its discussions, its mandate renewals, and all products. So as we mark 2 decades since the adoption of the agenda, it's very clear that while there has been significant normative advances, and sometimes we forget that, we've had 10 resolutions, we've had, I think, something like 28 national action plans within the European Union, and we've had a modest success, I suppose, in the implementation, but it's not enough. There's really much more work to be done to ensure the full implementation of 1325 and the subsequent resolutions as well. Ireland also recognises the full and equitable inclusion of young people as essential for building sustainable peace, and the interdependent and interconnected nature of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda with the Youth, Peace and Security Agenda. Our third National Action Plan on the implementation of the 1325 includes among its objectives the strengthening of the voice of young people, facilitating intergenerational dialogue and engaging young women and girls. It's clear also from the global landscape around us with regard to gender equality that it remains very challenging. We have seen in recent months and years a significant global pushback against hard-won gains on women's rights. In addition, with the onset of COVID-19 earlier this year, the devastating impact of this pandemic is felt disproportionately among women and girls, and the long-term impact of the pandemic has the potential to set back years of progress on gender equality. As millions more women and girls are pushed into poverty, they're pushed into early marriage, and they're at increased risk of gender-based violence. The importance of gender equality and ensuring the equal rights of women and girls has never been more important. Ireland has also played an important leadership role in forging consensus around the need to advance gender equality, from our work on agreeing the Sustainable Development Goals to our role as co-chair of the Commission on the Status of Women. Our National Action Plan on WPS has been held up twice by the UN Secretary General in his WPS annual reports as one of best practice, and we have been sharing the lessons we have learned over the last 3 NAPs with other countries to assist in the effective implementation of the agenda. And again, that's it. It's no good having a NAP if you can't implement it and if you can't monitor its implementation. So that's really important for us. And we are strongly committed to bringing this leadership to our seat on the Council next year. A major priority for us will be to bridge the gap between the discussions in the Security Council in New York and the realities on the ground. We're committed to ensuring the voices of women from the ground, including representatives from women's rights organisations and other civil society representatives, are heard, and also to ensure their safety when doing so. We must listen to women affected by conflict and those who are working to build peace, including at the grassroots level, as I've said. Last month, our mission to the UN in New York held a high-level event to launch the report, Learning from Grassroots Women Peace Builders to Advance the WPS Agenda Beyond 2020. This report is a culmination of consultations organised by UN Women and Global Women's Network of Peace Builders, with grassroots women peace builders in Belfast, Bogota, Kampala and Pretoria. The project was funded from our Stability Fund in the Department of Foreign Affairs, and our missions in all of those countries assisted with the process. We were honoured to have Her Excellency Mary Robinson give the opening address at the launch, and we heard from representatives from each country talk about their work. Later we can put the link to this report up on the chat line here if you're interested in it. The report highlights the key challenges and opportunities for the implementation of the WPS agenda, and it takes into account the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on their work. On foot of this report, we will continue to demand the full, equal and meaningful participation of women in peace processes. We will also demand that gender issues are taken into consideration in peace processes by UN envoys, by special reps and by mediators. Our work will involve ensuring a stronger focus on women, peace and security across all aspects of our work at the UN, including on the Independent Experts Group, the Peace Building Commission, and with other critical organs of the UN, such as the UN General Assembly and the Human Rights Council. We will look for ways to strengthen accountability for the agenda. National, regional, and organisational action plans, specifically those that are financed, are key ways to guide this implementation. We must invest in initiatives that promote gender equality and provide direct assistance to women's organisations. If anything, this 20th anniversary of 1325 has shown us just how much work there is to do to advance and to broaden the global consensus around full implementation of the agenda. The strong voice of civil society will continue to be, as it always has been, essential to receiving this goal. I would like to thank the Irish Consortium on Gender-Based Violence for their tireless work in this area and look forward to continuing to engage with the consortium, building on the important work that they have taken forward in the last 15 years to ensure global attention is focused on addressing gender-based violence. I'm also very much looking forward today to the discussion here and on hearing the panelists' views and others on the all-important question, how can we build a feminist women, peace and security agenda? It won't be easy, transformative agendas never are. We have to bring everybody along with us and show that it will benefit all of us. But I am going to sit back now and listen to the panelists and look forward to the discussion later on. And again, once again, thank you so much for this invitation to open this event this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Áine, and thank you for that really excellent way of setting the scene and reminding us, of course, that there's a lot to do in terms of the transformative agenda, and we have 5 excellent speakers here today to tell us exactly where they think we should be focusing that energy and focusing our efforts. I'll come to each of those in turn, but just to say a huge thank you to each of our 5 speakers, who are Sarah Cotton, Public Affairs and Policy Advisor with the ICRC, Adil Kazaz, MENA Regional Gender Coordinator with Oxfam International, Zainab Kaya, Visiting Fellow with the Middle East Centre at the London School of Economics, Commandant Gillian Collins, PSS Gender Equality and Diversity Advisor with the Irish Defence Forces, and Lucía Baca, who's a coordinator with Colombia Diversa. Thank you all for being with us. And I'd like to turn first to Sarah to ask to set the scene and open with some introductory remarks about how we can build indeed that feminist women, peace and security agenda. I'll hand over to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, and thanks so much for having me, and indeed all of the speakers. I'm really looking forward to the discussion as well. My name's Sarah. I work for the International Committee of the Red Cross, and we have been invited here as a close partner of the Irish Red Cross, who are a member of the consortium. So thanks go to the Irish Red Cross as well. I just wanted to sort of give a pitch, really, which is that feminist peace must be built during conflict. We're a humanitarian organisation, and we really engage in insecure environments and conflict contexts. So the broader women, peace and security agenda, this is the angle in which we approach it from. And from our perspective, feminist peace will be better facilitated if violence of conflict does not deepen pre-existing gender inequalities. Women must be heard during conflict, and violence must not set them back further, because there is that possibility of regression as well during conflict. I think that I appreciate there's 5 minutes to talk about this, which is a sort of huge subject matter in a very short time period. So I'm going to sort of cut to the chase. There's 2 ways in which we think that a feminist peace can be built during conflict. Firstly, a proper contemporary understanding of the law which governs the actions during armed conflict, which is international humanitarian law. And secondly, a gender inclusive humanitarian response. So on the first, international humanitarian law, comprised of the Geneva Conventions and its additional protocols, was written a long time ago. However, its understanding has evolved in many areas, and in terms of what it says about women, it's no exception. There are a number of rules connected to international humanitarian law which specifically articulate differentiated treatment for women. These include breastfeeding mothers, pregnant women. They include that due regard, in quotations, be given to the specific needs of women outside of these 2 groups and the others that are mentioned. Furthermore, it says that humane treatment should be given without adverse distinction founded on sex. And one of the things that the benefit of international humanitarian law and a contemporary reading is that understanding can evolve as legal and sort of contemporary practice evolves itself. So one of the things that sort of as a result of that principle of equality is that not only does that mean there's an obligation of non-discrimination, but there's a positive obligation to take steps to ensure equality. And because this is all kind of a bit legal, just to give a clear example of what I mean, in conflict that could mean positively ensuring that access to humanitarian relief is available to women as well as men, and indeed other groups, not just men and women, but children, people who are less able-bodied, etc. And also, because I'm aware of the time, I just want to sort of fast forward. I can go back on some of those bits regarding the law later in the discussion, but when it is respected, international humanitarian law has a positive and multiplying impact, and this includes for women. As just to give a couple of examples, if international humanitarian law is respected, detained women can maintain family contact, sexual violence can be prevented, civilian women can access humanitarian relief and medical care without gender-based discrimination. indirect effects on women of the conduct of hostilities, the ways in which war is fought, can be factored into military decision making. So there's a lot of potential, and this law is extremely important. Then my second part of my argument, in that during conflict there should be a gender inclusive humanitarian response. So in addition to the law, how humanitarian actors such as ourselves conduct their response in conflict has a critical role to play, ensuring that women in the communities with which we work can shape their response, and it really needs to be owned by them. So participation is part of it, but not the participation is not doesn't just mean delivery. One of the example in the way that we work is a community-based protection approach. What this means is that we work with different groups within communities, specifically including women, where the people within communities identify the problems that they face. We don't come in from whatever position of prior understanding of a conflict and explain to people what we think they need. We receive that information from them. And when that comes to women, that's extremely important, and not least because these are often voices that are not at the forefront, and that really need to be actively discovered. And just to say that although much has been done, and much is being done currently, as an organisation, the International Committee of the Red Cross is also aware that more needs to be done. In December last year, we had an international conference of the Red Cross and Red Crescent, so all of the component parts of the movement of national Red Cross and Red Crescent societies, as well as the International Committee of the Red Cross. And we pledged to convene an expert meeting and prepare a report to identify ways in which the application and implementation of specific international humanitarian law obligations can have different impacts on diverse groups of women, men, boys, and girls, and consider corresponding practical implications for how IHL is applied and implemented. So there is more work to be done. There is more work that needs to be done. But one of the sort of just a final thought is, if the voices of women and girls are not present in shaping humanitarian response, if their needs are not explicitly thought of in the application of the law, a feminist peace moves further out of reach.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And a note to say that I know that we've set you the unenviable task, our speakers today, of setting out some initial remarks in what seems an impossibly short space of time for such a rich discussion. But I can assure you and all our participants who will be really keen to hear more that we're going to come back to those key points in the discussion. Thank you so much for those initial insights. And I'd like to turn now to Hadil Kazaz, who is the MENA Regional Gender Coordinator with Oxfam International, to share her opening remarks on how we can build a feminist women, peace and security agenda. Over to you, Hadil.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me. And I think this is a topic that we have been interested in for a long time, but mainly in the last year or so. Zainab is one of our researchers who helped us think through what the feminist peace may sound or look like. I will leave more of this to her, and I want to focus on, actually the report is out, and I will also put it on the chat, the link to that report on the chat. I just want to focus on three points that I hope will be helpful to provoke a discussion rather than provide answers. So in our engagement with the different researchers and activists around the globe, basically in Africa and Asia Pacific, in MENA region, there were clear evidence that a feminist peace indicates there is a failure in the global architecture on women, peace and security. In MENA region, one of the most unequal parts of the world, this is a big issue. And these are the 3 points that I want to quickly touch on. Inequality in connection to peace and security, accountability and what does it mean, and redefining the protection and what does protection mean. if we talk about inequality, we start, and here I will disagree a little bit with Sarah, because feminist peace doesn't start with conflict. It actually starts before conflict and goes on after conflict. And inequality can lead to creating conflicts. Therefore, our understanding of how the gap between the rich and the poor, men and women, people who have and people who don't have, is actually leading to conflict. But also the conflict itself affects the people differently, and they may increase this gap. So as you rightly, Sarah, said, gender gaps can and gender-based violence can increase due to conflict. So is economic inequality, so is inequality amongst ethnic groups or sexually diverse groups or anyone who is affected by the conflict. Also, if inequality is not addressed rightly during and just after the conflict, it can cause actually a revert to the conflict. So any feminist peace would be starting before, during, and after conflict. And to do that, addressing inequality is one of the main key factors, or what we call it root causes of why conflicts are created and how we can overcome them. And how, while overcoming inequality, not only we are creating more peace and security, but also we are preventing future conflicts and future wars. In the MENA region, just recently, a study showed that since COVID-19, actually, the amount of wealth that was gathered in the hands of the wealthiest in the MENA region is actually double the amount of money that is needed to address the COVID-19 influence. And actually, it is 5 times more than the humanitarian needs for the region. So this shows that without addressing inequality in all its different forms, it's not possible to have any feminist peace. And this leads me to the other point, which is accountability. And by accountability, we don't only mean how governments can be held accountable. It's the responsibility of the international community. It's the responsibility of the NABs at the wealthier countries in the north. It's the responsibility of women themselves. When we talk about the current architecture of the NABs and what it calls for in terms of protection, prevention, and participation, who is sitting on the table, who is opening doors for peace and security, and how these women, how no matter how few they are and how small their numbers are, they have the key to opening doors for others to participate in the peace and security. They have responsibility also to indicate the different diverse voices, because there's no one voice. And in the best women peace and security plan, we find that certain types of women usually are represented on the table, and they don't. And when we talk about community protection, yes, that's important. When we talk about community peace building, it's very crucial. But are these voices heard? Are these considerations heard? Then accountability also of the funders and donors and IMF and World Bank who have the power to impose sanctions or to provide incentives or loans or any kind of support. So basically, the accountability is both vertical and horizontal. Finally, and I will end here, about the protection dilemma. If we are talking about protection for whom? It's not for the victims only. It's also for people who are first responders, who are human rights activists, who have voices to represent the community. It's also protection for LGBTQ community. It's voices not for the most marginalized, but also for the most vocal, and people who are able to bring a different understanding of what women, peace, and security is about. I will stop here, but I'm happy to participate in the discussion later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hadil. And again, another excellent set of reflections just to set us off. And we're going to come back to many of those rich points in the discussion. So a reminder to our participants who are hearing all of these comments and insights, please do put your questions in the chat and we'll pitch them to our speakers shortly. I'll turn now to Zainab Kaya, who's a visiting fellow at the Middle East Centre at the London School of Economics. And Zainab, I know that you've done some work with Oxfam and particularly might be able to build on some of what Hadil mentioned in terms of that research. So I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to express my thanks to Abby and Caitriona and the Irish Consortium on GBV for including me in this great event. And it's lovely to see you, Hadil. And I'd like to add how much I enjoyed working with you and the Oxfam team on the Feminist Peace Project. So my reflections here, I'll try to keep them as brief as possible, and they will be building on that report that Hadil mentioned. I'd like to start by saying that I'm taking a bigger picture view here rather than focusing on a particular aspect of peace and security or the women peace and security agenda. Kind of from a more academic perspective, how I see the agenda is being implemented and its implications. And these are obviously just opinions, so I'd like to hear everyone's thoughts and criticisms on these views. But where I will start is to say that the dominant international discourses of peace and security lack, as they stand right now, the current ones lack a genuinely transformative feminist peace and security conception. And this is even the case with the Women, Peace and Security agenda, which many initially hoped would be transformative. I'm not saying this to overlook the important work that has been done around the Women, Peace and Security agenda in the security sector, in political participation and peace building and international development, humanitarian sector. And this is a type of work that needs to continue, but we also need to keep discussing and assessing the way it is implemented. We need to keep evaluating whether it is achieving its transformative goals or is it moving away from those goals. Here I'd like to echo Cynthia Enlow's book, The Big Push, published in 2017, where she challenges the persistence of patriarchy, which somehow manages to live and persist even through agendas such as women, peace and security. So we need to see, because of the power relations that she talks about, because of the power relations and dynamics embedded in the international system and international security. So as you can tell, I'm having a more of a critical feminist lens towards power, structures and institutions. So we need to think beyond women, peace and security and the existing institutions in place that are leading women, peace and security to be implemented in a particular way. So here I'm trying to posit a more holistic vision of peace and security that's truly people-centered. A transformative feminist analysis, I think, can offer multiple advantages over the current securitized approach, including a potentially genuinely transformative vision of peace and security, a gendered understanding of the root causes of conflict, the continuum of violence through peace and conflict, a nuanced and context-sensitive approach that safeguards against future conflicts. Indeed, I think the current, the gender-sensitive, we call them gender-sensitive international frameworks as they exist are leading to inadvertently contradicting outcomes sometimes for achieving feminist peace and security. And the areas in which that I see this the most are in the way we approach the sexual violence in conflict, the PSVI framework, and the instrumentalization of women, peace and security agenda through the CVE, PVE agenda, countering violent extremism. And there's a lot of instrumentalization and securitization there that I think is, quite dangerous in some ways. The other area I see this is the politics of donor funding in the international development and international humanitarian work. And also in the humanitarian work and development, the resilience policy that puts the emphasis on individuals and communities in transformation rather than focusing on the wider structural inequalities and institutional context that actually creates the problems. So we are seeking solutions in the communities, whereas they are not the sources of the problem. So basically, I know I'm running out of time, probably I have about 2 minutes, just quickly. In some ways, women, peace and security agenda has emerged, and it still is an outcome of a women's rights activism that has truly transformative potential. But this potential has been curbed because now it's become part of a number of UN Security Council resolutions. It's become pretty much the part of the system itself. And I'm not criticizing this because this is not necessarily a bad thing, but with any institutionalization, with anything that's become institutionalized and established, there are issues of overlooking the problems that might emerge within that internal framework. And we need to watch out for those possibilities. For instance, there has been an increase in more inclusive political and transnational platforms as well. However, when the systems and international peace and security institutions are adopting these agendas, they can sometimes become too rigid or harder to transform within. And I'm sure colleagues who have feminist agendas that are trying to change the system within are experiencing these obstacles and difficulty in that. I can easily relate to them. So especially the UN Security Council decisions, I think if we analyze them and the content of them and the way they are implemented with regards to conflict, security and war, they are still typically dominated by the interests of the powerful states, dominant normative discourses and mentalities. And typically still, unfortunately, the state interest and security are associated with traditional conceptions of power, whether defined in material or normative terms. So where I stand, from where I look, the WPS agenda has become selective and a bit ritualistic in its engagement with the feminist perspective. The agenda is limiting in that it reduces the spaces and opportunities for influential and transformative actions. Its conceptual underpinnings rely on a liberal feminist paradigm at times. And it overlooks the wider spectrum of feminist approaches and conception of peace that exist. And I'd refer to what Hadil said. There is no one conception of feminism. There is no one conception of security and peace. When one framework becomes dominant and become internationally adopted, it can silence other ways of understanding these concepts and notions. So we need to watch out for that, I think. We need to keep the dialogue open. We need to watch out for silencing different voices and, think about other ways of creating constructive platforms where these different meanings and agendas can coexist to lead into a more transformational change going forward. I will stop there. I'm sorry if I have talked more than 5 minutes. Thank you.
No, thank you so much, and thank you for those really wonderful and rich insights and reflections. And we want to come back to that because already we're seeing some similar themes coming in across all of our speakers, and in particular questions around inclusion, around thinking about the diversity of those experiences. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Commandant Gillian Collins, who is the Gender Equality and Diversity Advisor with the Irish Defence Forces, and also I know has acted as a tactical level gender focal point, so has that practical experience of UNSCR in operations as well. Thanks for being with us, Gillian, and I'll pass over to you now.
Thanks, Caitriona. I'm delighted to be here today among so many great panelists, really interesting voices heard already, and thank you to the ICGBV for their invitation. I suppose firstly to note that I'm speaking from a particular perspective when it comes to 1325 and the Women, Peace and Security agenda, and that's obviously as a member of the Defence Forces, as the Gender Equality and Diversity Advisor within the organisation, but also as a woman within a military institution. And I suppose my experiences both at home and abroad have, and indeed within the context of my current role, have influenced my thinking on the wider peace and security agenda. With that in mind, I suppose just to acknowledge I'm aware of the criticisms associated with military and security organisations and maybe particular women, peace and security agendas that they are pursuing, such as, for example, the increase of women within our ranks in military institutions. And I suppose there's always going to be that question of how a feminist agenda can support work within particular institutions, particularly as it pertains to the more traditional male-dominated institutions. And I suppose this leads me to my first point in terms of progressing the WPS agenda forward in the next decades. And I suppose it's to look at how this process of change is approached and who is included. And from my perspective, whether the military is seen as a hurdle or a support, I think we cannot be overlooked, I suppose, in contributing to the wider women, peace and security agenda. You know, as an organisation, we've done a lot in the last number of years in the implementation of a gender perspective, both at home and overseas, and with the view of trying to implement the aims of 1325. Such initiatives include the employment of gender advisors. So that means training individuals within the organisation to have that understanding of the women, peace and security agenda, instituting relevant training at various different levels of the organisation, induction level, career course training, but more importantly, in pre-deployment overseas training. Looking at various different initiatives then also at like the recruitment and the retention of women, which move towards more the equality of piece, I guess. And from an institutional perspective, in terms of not losing ground, I think what's extremely important is having firm policies in place, which we do with the Defence Forces Action Plan on 1325, and we're one of the very few militaries that have a specific military action plan. And also what's extremely important is that monitoring and evaluation piece that was mentioned by Zainab, and the fact that we are within the structure of the National Action Plan on 1325, which does lend to, I suppose, that accountability piece that was also mentioned in terms of a wider oversight and that cross-government approach that Ireland is implementing. In terms of the context of, I suppose, the anti-feminist rhetoric that is appearing in the framework of the Security Council, for example, I suppose at the national level we can see that smaller countries can challenge on a particular issue, and which can have a result of, I suppose, putting pressure on other countries or other entities to adopt a similar approach in certain circumstances on a particular piece. So I really think, and it goes back to my initial point, you know, the policymakers, the academics, the humanitarian community and peacekeepers, if we come together at a national level and promote what we are trying to achieve, that feminist agenda of WPS, and strive to make a difference. When you see we have our very first female general operating as Deputy Force Commander in UNDOF, you know, there are opportunities there for us to promote this really on a national scale. And I suppose just as a parting point, just to add that in 20 years, you know, I don't expect that hegemony will not exist and that it won't be influencing gender norms. But there is a way to move towards that more democratic space where there's more value placed on gender diversity, equality and equity. And this really is being embraced by both male and female personnel in my organisation, and from the very top, which is really key. And I suppose the challenges are there, but slowly but surely change is taking place. And I feel like it should be encouraged to go forward at all levels and across all efforts. That's all from me. Thanks, Caitriona.
Thank you so much, Gillian. And again, it's an excellent point that I know we're all keen to come back to in the discussion, particularly this point around kind of backlash or holding on to that progress and making sure we don't lose ground is something I think many of us are keen to pick up on from Áine's remarks as well, that sort of backlash or resistance. Before we go to Q&A, just a reminder, if you're in the audience and you have burning questions and have been inspired by what you've heard so far, please do put your questions in the chat and we're going to come to them shortly. But before we do that, I'd like to hand over to Lucía Baca, who's the coordinator with Colombia Diversa, a feminist activist and working on their peace and transitional justice team. I'll hand over to Lucía.
Thank you so much, Caitriona, and thank you, ICGBV, for the invitation, and also everyone who's joining us here today. Well, the benefit of going last is that I got to hear everyone else's presentations, and there's so much I'd like to comment on, but I'm going to try to limit it for now and then save a lot of it for the discussion. So I think before I get to sort of like the meat of the question, I think it's important to sort of give a little background about our work and the situation in Colombia. So as many of you know, Colombia had a half a century long conflict with the longest lived guerrilla in the world and signed a peace deal recently in 2016. But what you may not know is that that conflict has taken a differential and disproportionate toll on LGBT people. throughout the war, state and non-state actors have subjected LGBT people to coercion, sexual violence, torture, forced disappearances, forced displacement, and even death, and that for daring to break with prevailing gender norms. And so with that in mind, that peace agreement became the first ever to explicitly recognize the LGBT people both as victims of the armed conflict and also as agentive peace builders who were sort of capable of contributing to a new Colombia. And it actually includes several commitments to promoting their participation in politics and in their citizen participation as well. And of course, the WPS agenda was sort of was crucial to achieving achieving this gain for LGBT rights and for a more inclusive gender perspective in peace agreements. And so what we do right now is we work with LGBT victims, survivors of the armed conflict to promote their rights and also to promote the participation of LGBT people in peace building in general, which sort of includes the peace agreement and the WPS agenda in a broader sense, and peace and security in a broader sense. And so as part of this work, and this is sort of what helps me answer that question, how do we get to a feminist vision of WPS? How do we get to a feminist vision of peace and security? We've spent the past few years studying how exactly conflict-related violence that's based on sexual orientation and gender identity operates, right? Why are armed groups targeting LGBT people? What role does this play in the armed conflict? And many people, and even people who have the power still to decide what even constitutes conflict-related violence, what violence is even worth prosecuting, still believe that this is collateral damage. It's nothing more than a byproduct of war, which is what we once said about, what others once said about sexual violence in wartime is still being said about SOGI-based violence in wartime. And we stress based on our findings that it's exactly the opposite, right? Just like gender-based violence, which includes SOGI-based violence, is at the core of conflict, violence against LGBT people is at the core of conflict. It's not random, it's not isolated, it's patterned, it's systematic, and it's intimately linked to the dynamics of war. And we actually believe that it rises to the level of gender-based persecution, which is a crime against humanity under the Rome Statute. I can give concrete examples of how this violence actually operated during the discussion, but for the sake of time, I'll move to how this informs my answer to the question of how we get to a feminist vision of peace and security. And so really the fact that SOGI-based violence is so linked to armed conflict is sort of at the heart of armed conflict. It really shows us that you can't separate heteropatriarchy, right? You can't separate the assumption that we all have to fit into diametrically opposed sexes. And the violence that assumption produces, you can't separate that from conflict dynamics because it shapes conflict dynamics and is shaped by conflict dynamics. And so that means that discriminatory gender norms, traditional gender norms, which include sort of the assumption that we have to be straight, which include the assumption that our genitals have to correspond with certain expressions of masculinity and femininity, that's also a driver of conflict-related violence. And that essentially shows the importance of sort of bringing an intersectional feminist agenda to bear on the WPS agenda and as a whole, and on discussions about peace and security more broadly. And because if we don't understand SOGI-based violence and conflict, we are going to keep having an incomplete picture of how violence operates during wartime. And that means that we're going to have an incomplete picture of the root causes of violence, which means we're not going to be able to address all of those root causes. And we're also going to continue neglecting the needs of an entire segment of the population. And so more importantly, what these conclusions show us is that in order to build this intersectional feminist WPS agenda, first of all, in a broad sense, we can't continue to reproduce and fall into the trap of add women and stir. Right? It can't just be add LGBT people and stir. That doesn't work. And that's often what ends up happening with LGBT inclusion. It actually, even government institutions here will say that, there are women, there are men, and then there are LGBT people. As if LGBT people were not also women and men. And so on the contrary, instead of just like falling into this trap of mere inclusion, we have to think in a more transformative sense. And that means several things. One, it means that we have to break down our binary conceptions of gender. And these are conceptions that plague the implementation of the WPS agenda, both on a high level, in the UNSC, in the UN, in UN Women, in our case, in the mission, in the verification mission in Colombia, and also on the ground, right? And that means defining gender and women as two distinct concepts. There's often this sort of like equation being reproduced of gender equals women, but that's just not the case. We need a more complex understanding of how gender operates in war. And related to that, we also need to challenge traditional notions of wartime violence. And that includes, as I was saying, the role of SOGI-based violence in war. And that also means understanding that SOGI-based violence cannot always be explained by prevailing paradigms. And that doesn't mean that we erase it because it doesn't fit, but rather that we have to rethink how those paradigms were actually built and how they're often built from sort of a masculine perspective that doesn't necessarily take into account how gender operates in a broad sense. And finally, and to touch on some of the points that other speakers brought up, we have to sort of shift our understandings of peace and security, right? When we discuss peace and security, we have to ask ourselves, peace for whom? Security for whom? And this is sort of what Zeynep was talking about in sort of silencing other perspectives, right? When there's a dominant
I think it sounds like perhaps we've just lost or had a slightly interrupted connection there with Lucía, and I'm very sorry that we've had that disconnect, but we're going to come back to Lucía as soon as we manage to reconnect, because we are very keen to hear the end of those particular remarks, and particularly as Lucía was coming to reflect on some of the comments shared earlier, that leads us into our discussion. So we'll loop back to Lucía just as soon as she is able to reconnect with us. But I'd like to thank all of our speakers for those really fantastic opening comments and a way to think about and approach this from different perspectives. As many people mentioned, it's important that we come together in that discussion and approach this from different perspectives. I'd like to begin maybe by asking that of everything we've heard, of course, many of us have a vision of a transformative agenda and a vision of how we might make really fundamental progress and really ambitious progress for the agenda in the coming years. But what does this mean in the context of anti-feminist backlash? And I'd like to maybe ask our speakers, particularly in a context where Áine mentioned pushback, Sarah also mentioned the risk of regression in the context of conflict. We are seeing anti-feminist pushback in contexts like the Security Council, for example. And I wondered if perhaps I might come to Zeynep first to remark the comments that you made at that sort of global level in particular. What does that mean for making progress or transforming the agenda even and improving the agenda when we're facing such resistance?
Thank you, Caitriona. Absolutely. I think the backlash that we are experiencing, it's interesting you mentioned that, because I was just teaching on a seminar with my students. We were discussing international development and gender, and they all in the end came back to this point of this anti-feminist attitude and this fear of feminism and the ideals that it entails, and increased emphasis and increased perceptions on that. And I think this is part of the wider international and national level political context that we are going through right now, with the rise of which has been happening for the last 10 years, and we are experiencing it more acutely in the last 4 or 5 years, I would say, more kind of authoritarian rules or an anti-progressive, progressive again defined by a particular group, but anti-progressive ideals and the rise of authoritarian rule all around the world. What happened in the UK. So I don't need to give examples for that. I think this what's happening with the anti-feminist backlash is definitely part of that wider political context. The second thing is, I think it's in the nature of things, especially when it comes to the transformation of socially constructed norms and rules that have been embedded in society for a very, very long time. We take those social constructions quite naturally. We think that this is the way it is. And many people, again, part of the political context, there is a tendency to maintain stability and order, and part of that is to maintaining the norms and ideals that are seen as prevalent in the society, that are seen as has been there for a long time, even though they are socially constructed, even though they are not natural. We see them as if they should be protected and preserved. So basically the patriarchy, however you define it, or the struggle against patriarchy somehow goes back to the same point again. There's a cyclical thing that's going on, and I'm sure we are not the only generation that is experiencing this. So I think I would say again, like, end with Cynthia Enlow's point on the resistance of, or the patriarchy is very resilient. Somehow it seeps through the cracks, and even though it may become part of the most feminist agenda, because sometimes feminist agendas overlooked the wider inequalities or the bigger picture, and then the very well-intentioned, with the good intention, well-intended policies might actually inadvertently lead to negative outcomes for certain groups of people on the ground. And again, we need to emphasize the importance of, the classic, understanding the context really well, understanding the wider structures really well, and always working with the local actors on the ground, and not only just in the implementation of projects, actually in the development of policies. In the development of ideas, in their inception, working with them and generate these things with them, and then making them not part of making them owners of those processes, and then in the implementation and its evaluation and assessment. I think those are ways of kind of being on guard. Cynthia Enlow says, you need to be on guard to see where it's coming from, because it comes without we even realize it, because it's so embedded in such a long time, for such a long time in our socially constructed world. So yeah, that's I would
absolutely. Absolutely, and I think fantastic remarks. I think to even point us back in part as well to Lucía, who we lost briefly, but I know Lucía was keen to come back to precisely this point and to reflect on your comments on that. So I'll invite Lucía, if you'd like to share and reflect. I know you wanted to input and reflect on what Zeynep had shared.
Thank you so much. I apologies, everyone. The internet always just cuts out at the worst time. But I only caught the tail end of what Zeynep was saying, but I actually very much agree in sort of what I caught. But I did just want to make one more point, sort of to close out what I was also saying earlier, and that's that, I was speaking specifically about how we need these new definitions of peace and security, and those definitions have to include this sort of dismantling those underlying structures of violence and discrimination that sort of are exacerbated during conflict, but are also transformed during conflict. And of course, that includes Stogie-based violence and discrimination. But what I wanted to sort of emphasize is that while keeping those structures intact may disproportionately affect us LGBT people, it really does end up impacting all of society, right? Not only because it forces all of us to continue living in boxes that may not actually fit for us, even if we're LGBT or not, but also because it, like I said earlier, it continues to drive violence, right? If those structures are not deactivated, which is something I think Hadil was mentioning as well, if those structures are not deactivated, we're not really preventing conflict. And that does need to be a focal point. For the next 20 years of WPS, we really need to think about those structures more in depth. And so all of that to say that, it's not enough to think about inclusion. We really do need to question and transform the underlying logics of how we understand conflict and peace and security.
Thank you so much, and thank you for bearing with through the internet disconnect, which of course has become part of how we all participate in these dialogues. But I think it's fantastic that you've mentioned that, and it points to a question we also received in the chat from Roisin Gallagher, asking on the back of Sarah's Cotton's comments about kind of inclusion and participation of women, and perhaps building on what Lucía and Zeynep have said. Sarah, Roisin was wondering, does the ICRC's commitment to include women include lesbian, bi, trans women and women of other identities? And if so, perhaps also to ask, maybe broadening out, thinking internally, institutionally as organizations, what do those of us who are proposing or promoting women, peace and security and inclusion need to do to make sure that we're delivering on that promise and on that aspiration internally, and that we're seeing that inclusion within our own institutions as well. If you had any thoughts on that, Sarah.
Thank you. I almost had too much time to think about an answer to that question, because now I have like endless responses. But what it most reminds me of is sort of attending the many events there were on the trying to end sexual violence in conflict last year and in the last sort of 18 months. And there was one the event that took place in Luxembourg, which had a sort of catchphrase, if that doesn't belittle the idea, which is nothing about us without us. And this is what kind of comes to mind a bit when talking about this. I think, of course, the ICRC would seek to respond to the needs of anyone, and that includes people who are more vulnerable, frankly, as a result of their gender identity or their identity in any way. And we very much attempt to take an intersectional approach and to look at the vulnerabilities that individuals may have, and not just vulnerabilities, actually, the strengths that people may have in a situation in conflict, because that's the environment within which we work, or organized violence, and that's the situation in which we work. But looking at the fact that the age that someone might be, the sexual orientation that someone might be, the if they have a disability, their gender, there's so many different, their ethnicity, their political allegiance, no matter what it is, there are a lot of different factors, and we need to factor into our analysis. I guess sort of 50 years ago, a political analysis by the ICRC of a context in which we were working would really be restricted to men, because those probably would be the people who are in charge or leading armed forces and armed groups and things like that. And I think this has completely changed. But what's important is the organizational change behind that. And that's I don't want to spend too long on that right now, but can come back to it in another question. But I think for us, it's, we for a long time we've been striving for gender parity, but that is like a tip of an iceberg of all these issues. So there's a lot more, and actually what I think, or I'd like to spend my time mentioning is the fact that one thing that the transformative agenda is just bigger than our part of this world. However, one perspective we have with the law and how international humanitarian law, which is so close to our hearts and our identity, is that its development is iterative. And one thing that one of my colleagues who was talking to me about how to best prepare for this event was saying is we need to think about who the interpreters are of the rules. It doesn't, and in my instance, I'm talking about international humanitarian law, but it could be human rights law, it could be, not law at all, it could be international norms or understandings, etc. Who are the interpreters? What is their interests? And has the perspective of women and all of these other identities we're talking about been taken into account? And is the objective of the interpreter to empower those individuals? And if not, then it's not, then we're going against what I started off with nothing about us without us. So I would I'm not saying that sort of we need to have sort of a long list of legal interpreters of every different intersectional identity, but equally we need to be listening to the voices in all areas of expertise, and this is just one example. So yeah, in terms of a humanitarian response, people who have a non-binary gender identity are often extremely vulnerable in conflict, and we attempt to seek them out. It is extremely difficult, and we can and should and always should try better. But no, of course, we would seek to respond to those needs.
Thank you very much. And I think particularly in terms of the humanitarian response and thinking about what that means, and I wanted to come also then to Hadil and ask, Hadil, do you think that there's more that we could be doing as NGOs, as civil society actors, as advocates, as a movement, to really demonstrate and live those values around a feminist women, peace and security? Do you see those being represented or enacted, or is there more that we might do?
Yes, indeed. I think we have a lot to do in terms of, first of all, not only defining what principles and values we work on, but actually hold ourselves accountable to how adapted these principles are within our organization and within our relationships with partners and communities and vulnerable groups. The issue which Sarah mentioned about who owns the power is the crucial one. Any feminist piece is inclusive, intersectional, diverse, but these are words if there is no true shift of power and the true transfer of power. And in terms of, for example, who gets to go to international forums, who gets to speak in the name of these people, who gets to represent them. Usually the more educated, the ones who speak the language, the ones who are privileged anyway, or even the staff of the NGO, the INGO that is working. So starting from this, looking at the mirror and actually trying to understand who should be there, who should be representing, and what kind of representation. And there is always the fear of tokenism in the representation. So you bring a woman and one woman or two women in a national plan of action or in a peace mission or in a peace negotiation, and you say, oh, but we have women. It's not that. And it's not also about number. It's about representing the issues, the challenges, the actual challenges, and the actual experiences which these people live. Very often, especially in peace and security, which is a power structure by itself, these voices are not heard or not seen valid or not seen important. In a recent experience, for example, in Yemen, when our protection team wanted to present a sanitary towel in the safety and dignity kit, then the person who was receiving from the government side or the official side receiving the kit said, no, we cannot do that. And the man who was representing our organization accepted. When he came back to the office and he was telling this to the staff meeting, our colleagues said, but you acted on behalf of these women. You didn't know why we wanted this, and you assumed because you want, of course, and we understand you want to give access to the food and to water and to other issues. You were able or you are willing to give up a certain important item, which we believe that it was much needed. And this created a dialogue inside the organization about what are we going, and very often in peace and security negotiations, there are things that have to be given away in order to have agreements or to sign off agreements or to have a certain understanding. And usually the things that are given away are seen by the men and the male-dominated patriarchal society as not important. These are the things that are more important for women, children, people with disability, people with sexual diversity. These are the things that are the first to be given away. We have evidence of that from working on the ground, and the challenge for us as organizations is really to hold ourselves accountable before we go and preach for the others, and before we try to say that's what you should be doing. We need to know what our staff, our people, the way we partner is redefined to change the power balance and to shift the powers to the hands of people who it really matters for them.
Thank you very much. And I think I'd like to also give Gillian an opportunity. I know that looking at institutional change and organizational change is very much within your focus. And we had a question in the chat as well from Tenant Wenge, who asked, could you say more about what a military action plan does and how does it capture it? Maybe to build on Hadil's point, what are the defence forces doing, or what might be provisioned within that action plan to hold ourselves accountable and to think about those issues? Thanks.
Yeah, I referred to some of our initiatives already in terms of the implementation of gender advisors or the training of personnel. And I suppose really what we're trying to achieve is to try and incorporate that gendered thinking in all aspects of the organization, in our planning processes and in the execution of our operations. And that will stem really from the level of, if we are in a particular mission and our mandate specifies that we must allow for freedom of movement, for example, well, or a safe and secure environment, if we take that, you know, a safe and secure environment for men and women in a particular context might mean two very, very different things. And that's what we are there to provide. It can also reach to the level with our training that we're trying to incorporate that gender thinking to every soldier on the ground, to look at a given situation and say, hang on a minute, how is this affecting all different groups and categories differently, and how they deal with the situation then we hope is influenced by that education. Engaging with women's organizations, for example, on the ground, something we traditionally would not have, you know, been engaged in that space. But more as I suppose we move into that area of CIMIC, like civil and military cooperation, these are considerations that the military are taking into account. Also in the context of our action plans, we are looking at, and in the context of the third draft, which I'm now working on, you know, we're looking at our own processes as regards gender-based violence, for example, and our policies on that. We are looking at our own processes in terms of SEA and to ensure that we have strict code of conduct and disciplinary rules in place and that they're strictly enforced. We're looking at specialist training if that's required, be it maybe for medical personnel or for military police or for personnel who may be faced with having to investigate cases of GBV. I suppose it's about exploring the overall concept of 1325, what we're trying to achieve, and then see how we can implement that or fit that into our own organisation, really.
Thank you so much for that. And please, just a reminder to our participants, time is moving along, but there's still plenty of time for discussion. And so please, if you have a question, do share it in the chat. And I wanted to come to a question that was shared by Brona Lawson regarding structural trauma, and perhaps particularly to come to Lucía first. Something that you said that resonated with me is the idea that this isn't incidental or a casualty or a byproduct of the kind of violence that you're talking about. It's targeted and systematic. And I suppose to hear your thoughts on what Brona has asked, saying, you know, is there any discussion around structural trauma in the context of women, peace and security, and the impact that's having on people's ability to organize, to be creative, to pursue that kind of greater equality?
Thanks, Caitriona. There is, well, at least as far as Colombia goes, there is a conversation ongoing about, in our organization and in other organizations, about sort of the structural trauma, the psychological toll that the violence that LGBT people and also women, although I focus on LGBT people and LGBT women, that toll takes on them, you know, on the way that they see their sexual orientation and gender identity, the way that they relate to it, the way that they relate to other people, the way that they're able to live their lives, establish full, meaningful relationships, both in terms of friends and in terms of family. In fact, even when families constantly reject them, right? You know, we were talking specifically about conflict-related violence, but much of what exposes LGBT people to conflict-related violence is that initial rejection and sort of being pushed out of their homes and into the streets by their families, which compounds the sort of trauma that they then experience as a result of conflict-related violence. I wouldn't say that I wouldn't classify some of those responses as risk-averse behavior. I think they're more survival tactics. And many of the decisions that LGBT people have taken after the fact of, for example, choosing to leave their territories or being afraid to establish new relationships and sort of, you know, just open up to other people. Yes, it might seem risk averse, but given their experiences, I think it's perfectly rational, you know, the way that they react to those things. And the difficult thing is that the state, you know, the government doesn't offer any sort of, I mean, in theory it does, in practice it actually doesn't really end up happening, sort of psychosocial support for survivors, right? And so as part of, for example, the process of documenting these cases, we have brought a psychologist onto our team in different points in time to sort of help out with that process, to prepare survivors to open up, to prepare them to deal with the trauma that they've experienced during wartime, or even beyond the armed conflict, and also to deal with, you know, with being part of a process, a legal process, because we've actually taken those cases to the tribunal that's meant to judge all the crimes committed during their own conflict. I'd also like to touch on two things, one that Sarah said and one that Hadil said, if that's okay, Caitriona?
Yeah,
awesome.
Go ahead.
Okay. I think, Sarah had mentioned, that the transformative agenda was sort of broader than the ICRC mandate, but talked about the importance of looking at the interpreters of the law and asking themselves if those perspectives include women and other groups. And I think that is part of the transformative agenda, absolutely. And that's, for example, part of the work that we've been doing ourselves. Even, for example, with the Rome Statute, right, thinking about gender-based persecution, there are interpretations of the word gender in the Rome Statute that are thought to be LGBT exclusive. We argue otherwise. There are also interpretations, crimes against humanity have to be systematic or have to be massive. Violence against LGBT people has not been massive in Colombia. We believe it's systematic, but there are interpretations of the concept of systematicity that don't include violence against LGBT people, because they always think that there has to be sort of premeditation behind them, as if it were the same, as if attacking an LGBT person, as if raping a woman was the same as organizing as taking over a police station or bombing a police station, right? As if it required the same level of thinking, when really patriarchy, heteronormativity, and cisnormativity already give armies, they already give armed groups a sort of script on which to act, right? It tells them, you can rape women and achieve this goal. You can threaten an LGBT person and society will condone it. And in fact, they might celebrate you for it. So I think that is a huge component, and I'm glad you brought that up. And a related, it's a different question, but I think, Hadil was also talking about how we live our feminist values in our organization. And I think a related question to how, the representation and who owns the power and how to achieve a true transfer of power is who gets to set the agenda. Right? And where the money is spent. Is it spent on initiatives being proposed by organizations on the ground? And if so, what is on the ground, right? Is it national level organizations, or is it local organizations from different parts of the country? Or is the agenda being set by international organizations, or is it being set by donors, or is it collaborative? And ideally it would be collaborative, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it is set by people with more power, and donors sometimes do make it difficult to sort of rearrange those power dynamics. And that's something I think we have to push back against as well, in order to sort of live our feminist values and make sure that the WPS agenda can actually become a reality in the most feminist sense of the word.
Thank you so much, and I'm glad you raised the question of power and financing. We had a question in the chat asking about funding for civil society groups, specifically in Africa, but I wanted to come perhaps to Zainab to make a comment on that and ask about, Zainab, in your remarks, you talked about power, you talked about where the locus of power was. Are you seeing funding moving to where it needs to be in this context? Are you seeing prospects that power is moving where it needs to be?
Thank you, Caitriona. Yeah, I mean, about funding, it's such a complex. It's become such a complex system, and different, the state's policies to support peace initiatives, or certain states' policies to support peace initiatives, humanitarian responses, development projects, and the funding that is available for these initiatives that are, well-intended initiatives, obviously, but the journey, the funding, the money takes to reach to the to where it's going to be used is a long journey, and it goes through a lot of barriers, not barriers in terms of, like, first of all, there is the problem of the framing for the particular project and how the donor wants that money to be used, in which way it wants it to be used. And then this basically shapes the activities of civil society organizations or activists or humanitarians or advocacy groups on the ground, because they shift their work in order to fit into the agenda of the donors' funding in some ways. And that's a problem. That's a big problem. And I'm not an expert on this field, but this is what come across from the research being done on this issue. I'm basically repeating what I have heard, and I think they are making good points and also providing evidence for this. The other issue is that this is security of funding. So the money is not going directly to the practitioners. Obviously, it's going through certain organizations, usually INGOs, UN, and other bodies. And then in there, comes the issues of who has contacts with who is a reliable recipient for a funding, who can manage to do projects, who appears professional, and then decisions are made. So money basically ends up going to certain groups. Again, not deliberately or maliciously, but inadvertently, the system leads to that. And again, it goes to groups who the funder or the whole ING or the UN thinks the organization will implement, use the money in the way that the funder or the ING wants it to be used. So that's kind of the issue I wanted the power relations play into that. And I just wanted to say a note on the structural trauma. From that comment, I thought, and please, Brona Lawson, I think, correct me if I'm wrong. So the structural trauma, is there a reference here to the structural violence that happens during peacetime, where, the social arrangements we have, the government, the economies, the religious systems, educational system, the way health is distributed, and there is no identifiable aggressor, but the structures of the system leads to violence by depriving groups from certain rights or by causing harm, and this happens in a long-term period, and it creates a different kind of trauma for the societies. And obviously, I can't define what is peace and what's security or what is conflict separately. But if we talk about this kind of structural violence happening in peace processes, in the conflict context, this kind of trauma might have a different kind of impact, and create different types of traumas. So is that what they were referring to? That's just kind of a question/comment.
Well, thank you for that, and I'll invite Brona. I think Brona is still with us, so if Brona wants to add in the chat, or we can of course link or share some of the resources that have been mentioned and connect people and those members, particularly through ICGBV, after the event. But I think on that, I'd like to think that that's a reminder to us, of course, that even after conflict is officially over, that we're still seeing the tremendous legacy of that violence. The work is very far from done, no matter the long road we may have traveled on WPS so far. And I wanted to come to each of our speakers to ask, in kind of concluding or in their wrap-up remarks, are you optimistic or hopeful about the next 20 years of WPS? And if so, what are you most optimistic about? We're facing any number of obstacles, but perhaps to share with us any optimism or hope or points that you think are particularly worthy of our focus and our efforts in the next 20 years. And I might come to Sarah first, if you'd like to share any concluding remarks.
Thank you. What an ask to try and conclude. I mean, I think, it's been so interesting, and I think the fact that the conversation is taking place and all the work that has been described is going on is just, absolutely crucial, and that gives me hope. I think it's been quite easy to be quite unhopeful recently, but yeah, I mean, I think for us a lot, it's there is a lot of bad to look at. We're in a pandemic. Wars are lasting longer. They are, the idea of peace after a war is extremely hard to achieve at the moment, even more so perhaps than it has been in the last 100 or so years. So there's a lot to not be pleased about, but equally, I think that what is good is that despite the political environment of the last few years around the world, I still think there is progress, there is iterative progress, there is understandings of from our perspective the law and practice by states, which is moving in the right direction. I don't think it's going as quick as anyone in this sort of webinar would like, but I think it's important to kind of not give up and to keep looking at what more can be done and inserting voices, authentic voices where they need to be heard, and that's sort of on the legal side. And on the humanitarian response side, I think that we face an almighty challenge to to meet the needs in the current world, and we need to plow on, but make sure that as the volume goes up, that the nuance around who is receiving quality sort of assistance and protection isn't lost. So yeah, so a mixed picture, but yes, I definitely, you know, in the long run, things are moving in the right direction.
Thank you very much. And Hadil, to come to you, your remarks, your reflections on 20 years of progress moving in the right direction. Where might we focus our energies and our attentions and efforts in the 20 years ahead?
Well, I am a little bit more optimistic. I think there is hope, and especially in the last few years, 2-3 years, there are certain signs. I want to mention a few of them. For example, the road towards generation equality and Beijing Plus 25 has brought the women, peace and security agenda closer to the discussion, and that's happening everywhere at all continents, at country level, at different levels. People are discussing how they are revisiting and connecting, for example, CEDAW and the CEDAW recommendation 30 together with the Women, Peace and Security agenda. They are vocal about highlighting the missing pieces of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, for example, addressing occupations, addressing certain types of violence, even addressing mental issues and post-traumatic disorders and as injuries. There is also challenging to the global pushback, and I wanted to comment on that, where there is some pushback or lashback, the global GAC rule, for example. There is at the same time a stronger SRHR movement around the world, coming from Latin America and actually leading us and showing the importance of addressing sexual and reproductive rights, not only in conflict, but in every context. So for that, I'm a bit optimistic. There is also more countries who are adopting feminist agendas. There are few. Until now, Sweden and Canada, but there are other countries who are interested, and by doing that, they are feminizing their foreign policies as well as foreign funding and global aid assistance. So while the aid picture is still dominant by the status quo, and there are still some kind of enforcing certain themes, for example, in the MENA region, addressing violent extremism as a main branch of women, peace and security, is being challenged by the women rights organizations and feminist activists, which is promising. It's not shifting completely right now, but just last month or within October, rejecting the Russian proposal in the UN security deliberation is also a promising act, because and it wouldn't happen without women and feminist groups and women rights organizations coming together, being prepared, analyzing the presidency of the Security Council in this remarkable month, which remarks the 20th anniversary of Women, Peace and Security, and understanding that the Russian proposal is not going to benefit a feminist agenda, and therefore it was rejected. So all of these are good signs. I would say we have a lot, of course, to do, a long road, but at least we are more aware of what's happening. And we are also in the funding scene, and that's my last point. In the funding scene, international organizations are realizing also the board structure within the funding for NGOs, and realizing that without addressing informal groups and social movements and reaching out to emerging groups, their voices will not be heard. Because that's where the feminist agendas are shaped. It's within informal and groups and social networks. Thank you.
And thank you for mentioning in particular what might be seen at least as a victory, or at least maintaining that space at the UN Security Council recently with that move. And I think an important point to keep in mind as Ireland prepares to take up its seat on the UN Security Council, and all of us who will be looking to Ireland to continue to show that leadership that we've seen at home as well. Coming to Zainab, final remarks, comments and reflections on those larger structural issues and that perspective in terms of WPS in the years ahead.
Mm-hmm. I'm an optimist at heart, and I think what we have achieved, the world has achieved, those who have been working on these issues is immense and should continue, and I know it will continue. I think everyone from the security sector to state officials, one way or another, they are, the fact that this agenda is part of the system now, and that now we are discussing and criticizing or assessing how it is implemented and what are the possible issues that are emerging from that process is itself is massive. I think, it's great. I think just the main thing is to just keep talking and not letting things become too established and too institutionalized, because the issues that we have in the world, from gender inequality to other issues like racism or violence against women, these are outcome of too much institutionalization and staying silent and silencing the voices that are. So I think the change is, we should remember that I think the change is from a more kind of critical international relations perspective. The change doesn't only come from the top and from the institutions. We should not rely on just them, and then we should also focus on other sources of change that are happening as important as the changes happening at the institutionalized level, and keeping that conversation open. Yeah, but yes, of course I am hopeful, of course.
Thank you so much. And Gillian, your thoughts as we prepare to particularly perhaps Ireland taking on that larger role, and thinking ahead to the action plan. You mentioned you're drafting a third action plan for the Defence Forces. Prospect for the 20 years ahead of WPS.
Firstly, I think what today has really shown us is that we're all striving in one way or another to achieve the same things and to achieve the same goals, which is comforting in a way. That you're not on your own in these initiatives or in these fights, I guess. I suppose for me, it's a case of, thinking about gender equality and thinking about gender norms and how they impact within a security context is not usual thinking maybe for an institution such as the Defence Forces. But what I'm really looking forward to is where this takes us. And really 1325 for the Defence Forces has brought about conversations that we never before had that we are now having. And it's also allowing us to look internally as well, in the sense of, if we're portraying these things on a national stage, how are we looking at it within our own organisation? If we're trying to address GBV by increasing the number of women within our ranks, we have to look at maybe barriers to women being in our organisation in the first place, or barriers to their progression or their participation. So I suppose from a Defence Forces perspective, I'm looking forward to seeing how that progresses and how we progress as an organisation, and as a result then how we can impact more greatly the WPS agenda on a wider scale, and particularly in our work internationally and overseas.
Thank you so much, Gillian. And finally, to come to you, Lucía, remarks, thoughts about how this agenda might progress. I know that you've mentioned so much of the exclusion or the marginalization of key groups. Are you hopeful that within the next 20 years we're going to see more meaningful empowerment, more meaningful inclusion? Will there be significant change?
Actually, I am hopeful, and I'm hopeful specifically because of something Zainab mentioned, is that change does not only come from the top, from institutions, but there are other sources of change. And for me, the source of change that gives me that gives me hope has happened at the civil society level, right? It is seeing broader and stronger and more inclusive coalitions of LGBT groups and women's groups working together to make the WPS agenda more inclusive. 10 years ago, it would have been unimaginable that a peace agreement would have explicitly recognized and included LGBT people. And the fact that we achieved that, it wasn't because of the initiative of the government. It wasn't because of the initiative of the FARC guerrilla. It was because of the alliances and the coalitions between the women's movement and the LGBT rights movements and the advocacy that they brought to bear, the pressure they brought to bear on the negotiating parties, and using WPS as a fundamental tool of advocacy. And now we're seeing even more coalitions sort of crop up of women's and LGBT groups working together for this goal to sort of break down that binary conception of gender and incorporate a more intersectional feminist agenda, not just in Colombia, but also in other parts of the world. For instance, in 2018, Outright International became the first LGBTI organization to join the NGO Working Group on Women, Peace, and Security. That's also a step forward, that we celebrate. And so, I think seeing that there's more acceptance, on the ground, and that acceptance is what's going to get us further, I think. So I am hopeful.
Thank you so much, and wonderful remarks from all of our panelists to end on, and particularly to maybe pull out those 2 points. One, the victories, the accomplishments, and the achievements, not only of all of our panelists, but the tireless work of so many who've joined us in our audience and shared comments. Many people have a lot to celebrate and to really acknowledge those accomplishments and that work. And the second is that message on coalitions, and I hope that this event has been an opportunity to strengthen that coalition among ourselves, and also to thank the ICGBV for the tremendous work that they're doing in bringing different stakeholders together. With that in mind, as we go, a few last minute points. We have a feedback poll for everyone who's joined us. Please do kindly share your feedback. That should be launching shortly so that we can take on board that input and your comments and feedback. The resources that were mentioned will be circulated by ICGBV along with a link to the recording. So for your colleagues, for your contacts, for everyone in your network who wasn't able to join today, please do circulate, and hopefully we can keep that dialogue and discussion going. And lastly, to note that the next event that the ICGBV is holding on these events will be next month. That will be a webinar on disability inclusive gender-based violence programming. So those details will be circulated by ICGBV, and please do join for that. Thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our speaker, Áine, who launched the discussion. And thank you in particular to all of the comments and the questions we got in the chat as well. We really appreciate it. It's wonderful.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Likewise, thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.